18 miniature coffins lined the attic floor of a house where no children had ever been seen. In the summer of 1896, a county surveyor climbing through the Appalachian Mountains found them arranged in 2 rows, from the size of a newborn to the size of a young child. The woman who lived below them told him she had never had children. The coffin said something else. Nobody in that hollow wanted to talk about what it meant, and for over a century, almost nobody did. There's a kind of place in the world where roads stop having names, where maps give up and go blank, and where the wind seems to carry secrets that no one dares repeat out loud. The Appalachian Mountains have always been that kind of place, and in 1896, there was a specific hollow in those mountains where the silence ran deeper than anywhere else. They called it Dry Fork, though the name appeared on no map and no county record held it. The hollow sat somewhere along the ragged edge where Virginia becomes West Virginia, or where West Virginia becomes Virginia, because in that stretch of ridge and valley, the state line was more suggestion than fact. Dry Fork earned its name honestly. The creek that ran through it never rose above ankle deep, even in the spring thaw, and the water came down off the ridgeline so cold it made your teeth ache to drink it. The hollow was narrow, maybe a quarter mile from wall to wall, and the slopes on either side rose so steep that the sun only reached the floor for a few hours each day. The trees grew tall and close, and under them the light had a green, filtered quality, like looking at the world through old glass. In winter, the cold settled into the bottom of that hollow like something poured there, and it didn't leave until April. If you wanted to reach Dry Fork in 1896, you walked. There were no roads, no carts, no horses strong enough to navigate the deer trails that wound over the ridge. The nearest town with a post office was 11 miles away by foot, and the nearest doctor was a day's walk beyond that. The families who lived in the hollow, maybe a dozen of them scattered along the creek, had learned to handle birth and death and sickness on their own because help was too far away to matter. They depended on each other the way people depend on a fire in January, not because they want to, but because without it, they will not survive. This isolation was not unusual for the Appalachians in the 1890s. Up and down the mountain range, hollows like Dry Fork existed in a country that technically owned them but practically forgot them. What was unusual about Dry Fork was the silence. Every hollow had its secrets, but Dry Fork held them tighter. Visitors were not welcome. Questions were not asked. And the people who lived along that cold creek had an understanding that what happened inside the ridge stayed there, and that breaking that understanding was a thing you did only once, because no one would give you a second chance. If you enjoy this kind of content and want to support the channel, the link to my ebook is in the description and in the pinned comment. Your support is what keeps this kind of content alive here. At the far end of Dry Fork, where the creek narrowed to a trickle and the ridge closed in like a door, there stood a property that the neighbors didn't talk about. The cabin was old, built from chestnut logs that had gone gray and dark with decades of mountain weather, and it sat in a small clearing with a barn behind it and a stone fence running along the front. The fence wasn't high, but it marked a line. Nobody crossed it without being invited, and nobody was ever invited. The woman who lived there was known to the valley as Mother Hunsicker. The name was not a kindness. Nobody called her Eliza or Mrs. Hunsicker or anything that implied she was a person you could sit with and pass the time. They called her Mother the way you call something what it is not, to remind yourself of the gap between the word and the thing. She was not a mother. She had no children, no husband, no family that anyone had ever seen. She was simply an old woman who lived alone at the far end of a hollow that already felt like the end of the world, and she had been there longer than anyone could remember. She was in her late 60s by the summer of 1896, though she may have been older. Mountain age is hard to read. The weather and the work carve lines into a face that make a woman of 40 look 60, and a woman of 60 look like something the hills themselves produced. Mother Hunsicker's skin had the leathery, creased texture of bark on an oak that has stood through too many winters, and her eyes had a flat, still quality that made people look away when she met their gaze. She wore the same thing every time anyone saw her, a heavy black shawl and a bonnet of stiff black felt that sat on her head like it had been nailed there. She didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't offer a greeting or a goodbye. When she came to the general store, twice a year, maybe 3 times, she bought what she needed, paid in silver or in trade, and left without a word that wasn't necessary. Behind her cabin, the hillside rose steeply toward the ridge, and there was a stretch of ground on the lower slope that she had marked off with stones. Nobody walked there. The neighbors assumed it was a garden that had failed, or a patch she used for something private, because in the mountains, a person's land is their own business until it becomes everyone's problem. And for a long time, Mother Hunsicker's land was not anyone's problem. It was just there, at the end of the hollow, behind the stone fence, under the black felt bonnet, quiet and closed and waiting. The carpenter's name was Amos Cade, and he was the only man in the valley who built things from wood that lasted. He made tables and chairs and cradles, and when the need arose, coffins. In the Appalachians of the 1890s, coffins weren't ordered from a catalog or bought from a funeral home. They were built by hand, measured to the body, lined with a burial quilt, and carried up the hill by the men who knew the dead. Amos Cade had built dozens of them over the years, for miners crushed in cave-ins, for women taken by fever, for old men who simply lay down one night and didn't get up. It was part of his trade, and he didn't think much about it. The first time Mother Hunsicker came to his shop, it was the autumn of 1874. She walked in out of the rain, her black shawl dripping, and stood by the door until he looked up from his work. She told him she needed a small coffin, the size of a newborn, and she gave him the measurements with a precision that unsettled him. Not because the numbers were strange, but because she gave them the way you give dimensions for a shelf or a door frame, like she was ordering a piece of furniture. Amos built it, a pine box, small enough to hold in one hand, with brass tacks along the edges and a white cloth lining. He didn't ask who it was for, because in the mountains, you didn't ask that question. A child could die, and often did. By the 1890s, roughly 1 in 4 children in the United States didn't live past their 5th birthday, and in the hollows of Appalachia, that number ran even higher. A coffin for a baby wasn't unusual. It was common enough that it carried no question with it, and Amos wasn't the kind of man who went looking for trouble. He delivered the coffin to her gate on a Wednesday afternoon. Mother Hunsicker came out of the cabin, took it from him without a word, and carried it inside. He noticed that she didn't carry it toward the door the way you carry something you are about to bury. She carried it the way you carry something you are bringing home. No bell tolled in Dry Fork that week. No neighbor came to sit up with the dead at her house. No mirrors were covered, no clocks were stopped, no salt was set out on a chest for the seining ritual that the old Scots families still practiced. There was no funeral on the hillside, no hymn sung, no mound of fresh dirt appeared behind her cabin. As far as the valley could tell, nothing had died. The coffin had simply arrived, and then it had simply gone inside, and that was the end of it. But it wasn't the end of it. Over the next 22 years, Mother Hunsicker returned to Amos Cade's shop at irregular intervals and ordered another coffin. Sometimes the gap between orders was 6 months. Sometimes it stretched to 2 years. But the pattern never fully broke, and by the summer of 1896, Amos Cade had built 18 of them for her, and he could not stop thinking about that number. The sizes varied. The first had been the size of a newborn, barely longer than his forearm. The second, ordered 14 months later, was slightly larger, the length of a sleeping infant at 3 months. The third was larger still. Over the years, the coffins grew in size the way a child grows. From something you could cradle in your arms to something that would hold a toddler, and then a child of 2, and then a child of 3, and finally, in the last few orders, a coffin large enough for a child of 4 or perhaps 5 years old. Each one was measured precisely, as if she were tracking a growth that no one else could see. Amos never asked her who the coffins were for. He never asked where the money came from, though it puzzled him, because she had no visible income beyond a small garden and a few goats, and the silver she paid with was always clean and exact, like it had been set aside for this purpose alone. He didn't ask because the code of the mountains told him not to, and because part of him didn't want the answer. But he noticed, and he remembered, and at night when the fire burned low and the wind came down off the ridge, he lay awake thinking about 18 coffins, sized for children in a house where no children lived. 18 coffins over 22 years. 18 small boxes, handmade, measured to fit a body that grew from birth to early childhood, and then started over again. The pattern wasn't random. It traced something, a sequence of losses that repeated and repeated, each one ending before the child could grow past a certain size. Each coffin marking the point where the growing stopped. And nobody in Dry Fork had ever seen a child at her property, heard a child cry, watched a child run along the creek. The coffins accumulated in whatever space she kept them, and the question that Amos Cade carried with him like a stone in his pocket was the same question the whole valley would carry once the surveyor arrived. What the coffins were for, and where the children they were built for had gone. The question existed in Dry Fork the way smoke exists in a room that has no fire. Nobody could say where it came from, and nobody wanted to be the one who pointed at it. The valley knew about the coffins in the way that a valley knows about everything, which is to say partially, indirectly, and without anyone admitting they knew it at all. Amos Cade knew because he built them. The general store owner knew because he sold her black fabric and salt and beeswax candles, the things a family buys when someone has died. A neighbor woman named Ruth Salyer knew because she had seen Mother Hunsicker through a window once, in the early years, and the shape of her body under the shawl had not been the shape of a woman who was alone. Ruth Salyer tried once. She walked down the creek path to the stone fence and called out to Mother Hunsicker, who was hanging wash on a line between two posts. She asked if she was all right. She asked if she needed anything. She asked, in the careful, roundabout way that mountain people ask about things they are not supposed to know about, whether there was a child in the house. Mother Hunsicker turned and looked at her, and Ruth Salyer later said that the look was not anger and it was not fear. It was the kind of look a door gives you when it is closed and will not open. Ruth went home. She told her husband that something was wrong at the end of the hollow. Her husband told her to leave it alone. She did. That was how it worked in Dry Fork, and in every hollow like it. The mountains produced a kind of silence that was not passive but active, a silence that chose what it covered and what it let through. A death in a family where people came to sit up with the body and dig the grave and stop the clocks. That silence was broken by ritual and community. But a death, or whatever was happening, at the far end of the hollow behind a stone fence, in a house where the woman did not ask for help and did not want visitors, that silence was kept by everyone, because breaking it meant admitting you had known something was wrong and had done nothing. The code of the mountains said that a person's business was their own, but the deeper truth was that the code also protected the people who followed it. In a place where every family depended on every other family for survival, a fracture in the community was a crack that the cold came through, and nobody could afford the cold. The carpenter kept building coffins, the store kept selling mourning supplies, and Ruth Salyer kept her distance, while the question sat in the hollow like fog on the creek, visible to anyone who looked, but impossible to grab hold of, because grabbing it meant holding it, and holding it meant answering it, and nobody in Dry Fork wanted to live with the answer. But there is a difference between not asking a question and not knowing the answer, and in Dry Fork, that difference was about to collapse. In the last week of August 1896, a man rode over the ridge into Dry Fork on a horse that was not built for mountain trails. His name was Henry Galt, and he was a surveyor employed by the county to map property boundaries along the Virginia and West Virginia border. He was 34 years old, tall and thin, with a face that looked like it had been designed for measuring things, all angles and straight lines. He carried a transit in a leather case and a chain for measuring distance, and he had papers from the county clerk that gave him the right to walk on any property he needed to in order to establish the boundary lines. Galt was an outsider who didn't know the code, didn't know that you didn't ask questions about a neighbor's business, didn't know that you didn't cross a stone fence unless you were invited, and didn't know that the silence in Dry Fork wasn't emptiness but architecture, built over generations and maintained by everyone who lived within it. He knew how to measure land and how to read a deed, and he knew that his job was to walk the ridge lines and drive stakes where the property corners met, but that was all he knew, and in Dry Fork, that wasn't nearly enough. He reached Mother Hunsicker's property on a Tuesday morning. The cabin sat in its clearing, the stone fence running along the front, the barn behind it with its sagging roof. He tied his horse to the fence post and walked to the door, and when he knocked, it took a long time for anyone to answer. When the door opened, Mother Hunsicker stood in the gap, her black bonnet framing a face that gave nothing away. He explained who he was and what he was there to do. He showed her his papers. She looked at the papers for a long time without reading them, then looked at him, then pointed at the hill behind the house. He could measure the ridge, she told him, and walk the upper slope, but he couldn't go inside the house, couldn't go inside the barn, and couldn't walk on the lower hillside behind the cabin, where the stones were. Galt nodded and went to work. He spent the morning measuring the ridgeline, driving stakes, recording the angles in his notebook. He was thorough and professional, and he would have finished the job and ridden out of Dry Fork without incident if not for two things. The first was the house itself. There was something about it that pulled at his attention, the way a sound you cannot identify pulls at you in the dark. The windows on the side facing him were covered from the inside with dark cloth. The air around the cabin had a smell he could not place, sweet and sharp at the same time, like camphor mixed with something older. The second thing was the lower slope she had told him to avoid. From the ridge, he could see it clearly, a stretch of ground below the cabin, marked off with stones, where the earth had a slight, regular unevenness that didn't look natural. It looked from that distance like a row of small mounds. He finished his work and rode out of the hollow that evening. But the image of those mounds stayed with him, and so did the smell of camphor, the covered windows, and the flatness in the old woman's eyes when she had told him where he could walk and where he could not. He came back the next morning. The sag in the roof of the cabin had caught his eye the day before, and he told Mother Hunsicker that he needed to inspect the attic beams for structural damage. It was not a lie. The roof did sag, and any surveyor worth his salary would note a failing roof on a property he was documenting. But it was not the whole truth either, because what he really wanted was to get inside that house. She refused. He explained that if the roof collapsed, it could injure her. She refused again. He told her that he had the authority of the county behind him and that he needed to document the condition of the structure. She stood in the doorway and looked at him with that flat, still gaze, and then, without a word, she stepped aside. He climbed the narrow stairs at the back of the cabin, the wood creaking under his weight, the space above him growing darker as he rose. The attic was low, barely high enough to stand, and the air was thick and close, heavy with the smell of old pine and camphor and something else. Something sweet and chemical that he could not name. The only light came from a small window at the far end, covered with the same dark cloth as the windows below, and it took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the dimness. When they did, he stopped moving. 18 miniature coffins sat on the floor of the attic in 2 straight rows, arranged from smallest to largest, like a chart drawn in wood. The first row held 9, the second row held 9 more. Each one was handmade, pine boards fitted together with small brass tacks, each one lined with white cloth. The smallest coffin on the left could have held a newborn. The largest on the right was big enough for a child of 4, maybe 5 years old. They were clean, well kept, and they had been placed there with care, with precision, with the kind of attention that suggested they were not stored here but displayed here, the way you display something that matters to you more than anything else in the house. He walked between the rows, and as he got closer, he saw that not all of them were empty. Some contained small bundles wrapped in white fabric. One held a lock of dark hair tied with a piece of twine. Another had letters scratched into the inside of the lid, a name and a date, carved with something sharp and unsteady, like a nail. He didn't touch any of them, just stood at the end of the second row and looked at the full arrangement, 18 coffins growing from the size of a fist to the size of a chair. And the truth of what he was looking at settled on him slowly and then all at once, like cold water filling a room. These were not supplies. They were not preparations for something that had not yet happened. They were a record. 18 coffins, 18 losses, each one documented and preserved and kept close, in the room above the woman's head, where she could sleep beneath them every night. And the mountain of silence that had covered this for 22 years, was sitting right there on the floor, in 2 neat rows, waiting for someone to climb the stairs and see it. But what Galt could not yet understand, standing in that dim attic with the smell of camphor in his throat, was that the silence had not been an accident. It had been built, one closed mouth at a time, and he was about to find out who laid every brick. Galt came down the stairs and found Mother Hunsicker standing in the doorway of the cabin, watching him. He would later describe her expression as nothing. Not anger, not shame, not fear, not even the guardedness of someone who had been caught in a secret. Nothing. The flatness of her gaze was the same as it had been when he arrived, the same as it was when she told him where he could and could not walk. She looked at him the way a wall looks at you when you push against it. He asked her about the coffins. She said they were hers, that she had bought them, and that was all. He asked whose they were for, and she said they weren't for anyone, that they had already been used. He asked about the children, because the sizes of those coffins could only mean children, and the tokens inside them, the hair and the names and the cloth, could only mean that children had died. She looked at him and said, "I have never had children." The denial was so complete, so total in its refusal to acknowledge what he had seen with his own eyes, that it created its own kind of gravity. He pressed her. He asked about the mounds on the lower slope, the ones he had seen from the ridge. She said it was her property, and she would thank him to stay off it. He asked about the name scratched into the coffin lid, the date, the lock of hair. She said nothing, just stood in the doorway and let the silence do the work for her. And after a while, Galt understood he wasn't going to get anything from her, not because she was hiding something, but because she'd decided long ago that what was inside that attic wasn't something she owed to anyone. And no amount of asking would change her mind. He left. He walked out through the stone fence and untied his horse and rode back along the creek toward the ridge. But before he crested the hill, he stopped and looked back at the property one more time. The house stood dark and closed against the clearing. Behind it, the lower slope stretched up toward the ridge, and from this angle, he could count the mounds. Small, evenly spaced, running in a row along the side of the hill, each one facing east. There were 18 of them, and they were too small, far too small, for an adult grave. He rode out of Dry Fork that afternoon with a notebook full of property measurements and a head full of something he could not measure. A woman who denied what the wood and the hair and the names declared, and a hillside covered in graves that no one had ever sat up beside, no one had ever tolled a bell for, no one had ever covered the mirrors for or told the bees about. But he'd seen what he'd seen, and he wasn't from Dry Fork, and he didn't carry the silence the way they did, which meant the valley had kept its secret for 22 years and was about to lose it in an afternoon. Galt didn't go straight to the county seat. He went to Amos Cade's shop first, because the coffins had been built by someone, and he wanted to know who and how many and how long. The carpenter was in his 60s by then, a thin man with hands that had shaped more pine boards than he could count, and when Galt told him what he had found in the attic, something changed in the man's face. It was not surprise, it was recognition. Amos Cade had been carrying the knowledge of those coffins for 22 years, and now someone else was carrying it too, and the relief and the shame of that sat on his features at the same time. He told Galt everything, starting with the first order in 1874, then the second 14 months later, and the steady sequence over the years that followed, always for a child-sized coffin, always measured precisely, always paid in clean silver. He told him about the different sizes, how they tracked the growth of a child from birth to early childhood, and then started over. He told him about the last order, which had come 3 years earlier, a coffin for a child of perhaps 4, and he told him that he'd never asked, not once, because asking wasn't something you did in Dry Fork, and he'd known that, and he'd lived with that knowledge the way you live with a stone in your shoe, by learning not to feel it anymore. Then Galt talked to the store owner, who confirmed that Mother Hunsicker had been buying mourning supplies for 2 decades, everything from black fabric for shrouds to salt for the seining ritual, the old practice of placing 3 handfuls on the chest of the dead to protect the soul, to beeswax candles for the vigil and camphor for washing the face and hands. The store owner had seen the list of purchases and had never once asked who had died, because in Dry Fork, you didn't ask, and because somewhere in the back of his mind, he'd already decided that knowing would be worse than not knowing. Then Ruth Salyer, the neighbor woman who had tried once. She told Galt about the visit to the fence, about the swollen shape she had seen through the window years ago, about the flatness of the woman's stare when she had asked if there was a child. She told him that she had gone home and told her husband, and her husband had told her to leave it alone, and she had left it alone, and she had been leaving it alone for 20 years. And finally, an old man at the far end of the hollow who remembered when Mother Hunsicker had first arrived. She had come alone, he said, already past middle age, with nothing but a trunk and a basket and a silence so complete it was like she had erased herself before she arrived. Nobody knew where she had come from. Nobody asked. She built the cabin, or had it built, and she moved in, and the hollow accepted her the way it accepted everything that didn't cause trouble, by ignoring it. The picture assembled piece by piece, like a puzzle where each person held one fragment, and none of them had ever put the fragments together because putting them together meant seeing the whole image, and the whole image was something none of them could live with. A woman had arrived alone. Over 22 years, she had ordered 18 child-sized coffins. No children were ever seen. No funeral was ever held. But the coffins were built, and the mourning supplies were bought, and the mounds appeared on the hillside, one by one, and every person in Dry Fork had held a piece of this knowledge, and every one of them had chosen to keep their hands closed. When Galt put the pieces together, the story that emerged was this. Mother Hunsicker had been pregnant at least 18 times over the course of 22 years. Each pregnancy ended, some ended at birth, the child drawing one breath or none and then going still. Some ended before full term, the body releasing what it had been carrying before it was ready to live. Some ended shortly after, the child surviving for days or weeks or months, long enough to grow a little, requiring a slightly larger coffin than the one before, but never long enough to live. In the extreme isolation of that hollow, with no doctor within a day's walk and no midwife closer than the next ridge, she had delivered each child alone and buried each one alone. The coffins were her only concession to the rituals the mountains demanded. She couldn't build them herself, not with her hands worn from the work of keeping a cabin standing and a fire burning and a body alive through 22 winters of childbirth and loss. So she paid Amos Cade, one coffin at a time, and when each coffin was ready, she carried it up the hill behind her cabin, placed the child inside, and buried it facing east, the way the old custom required, on the slope where no one was allowed to walk. She covered the mirrors. She stopped the clocks. She lit the beeswax candles and performed the seining ritual alone, waving a candle over the body 3 times and placing the bowl of salt on the small chest, scooping 3 handfuls to protect the soul, because even alone, even with no one sitting up beside her, she gave each child every protection the mountains knew how to offer. And then she brought the coffins back. She dug them up, cleaned them, relined them with fresh white cloth, and carried them up the narrow stairs to the attic. In each one, she placed a token, a lock of hair, a scrap of the shroud, a name scratched into the wood with a nail, a date. The coffins were empty of bodies, but full of what remained, and she arranged them in 2 rows on the attic floor, smallest to largest, like a timeline of every loss she had ever suffered. She slept beneath them every night for 22 years. The attic was not a storage room. It was a nursery for the dead, and she was the only person who ever visited it. The ambiguity that Galt couldn't resolve, and that the valley couldn't resolve either, was the question of whether the children died naturally or whether something else had happened. The isolation and the lack of medical care could explain every death. In the 1890s, child mortality in the hollows ran far above the national average, and those were the numbers for families who had help. Mother Hunsicker had no help. She was alone. But the flatness of her denial, the precision of the arrangement, the fact that not one single child out of 18 survived past infancy, and the fact that she had carried each coffin back to the attic and kept it like a monument, suggested something beyond grief. It suggested a woman who had turned loss into ritual, and ritual into something that looked, from the outside, like its opposite. You are left, as the valley was left, knowing enough to be disturbed but not enough to be certain, and that gap between knowing and certainty is where the story has always lived, in the hollows that the maps forgot. Galt filed his report with the county clerk when he returned from Dry Fork, describing the property boundaries, the condition of the structures, and, in a separate section at the end, the contents of the attic and the appearance of the lower slope. The clerk received it, filed it, and did nothing with it, because the county had no resources to investigate a woman in a hollow that took a day to reach by horse. There was no crime anyone could prove, no bodies in the house, no living children to protect, and no witness who would testify, because every person in Dry Fork had held their silence for 20 years and wasn't about to break it for a surveyor from the county seat. The report went into a drawer, the drawer went into a cabinet, the cabinet went into the back room of the clerk's office, and there it sat, unread, for decades. Mother Hunsicker remained in her cabin at the end of Dry Fork. The community didn't confront her, the carpenter never built her another coffin, and Ruth Salyer never went back to the fence. The store owner sold her the same supplies as before, black fabric and salt and beeswax, and they didn't speak of what either of them knew. The silence that had protected the secret for 22 years now sealed it, because the alternative was admitting that every person in that hollow had been complicit in something they could have stopped and didn't, and no one could bear that admission. So they chose what the mountains had always taught them to choose. They carried on, and they didn't speak of it. The last detail comes from a traveler, a man passing over the ridge in the early 1900s, who came upon the property looking for water and found the cabin empty, the door standing open, the stone fence broken in one place where a goat had pushed through, and the interior bare, the furniture gone, the fire cold. The attic stairs were still passable, and he climbed them, and the attic was empty too. No coffins, no cloth, no hair, no names, no tokens. Whatever Mother Hunsicker had kept up there for all those years, she'd taken with her, or she'd destroyed, or she'd put in the ground where no one could find them. But the lower slope told a different story. The mounds were still there, and they numbered 19 instead of 18. The 19th mound was fresh, the dirt still dark and loose, and it was larger than the others. It was the size of an adult woman's grave. It faced east, like all the rest, and the stones around it had been placed with the same care, the same precision, that had marked every burial on that hillside. Mother Hunsicker had dug her own grave, or she had dug it for herself, and she had lain down in it, or someone had laid her there, and the mountain had closed over her the way it closes over everything it decides to keep. The valley didn't investigate. They covered the mirrors and stopped the clocks and told the bees, because even the dead you fear deserve the rituals. And then they never spoke of it again. Dry Fork is still there, if you know where to look for it. The creek still cold, the ridgeline still steep, the silence still layered and dense and alive. And somewhere on the lower slope, behind a cabin that is no longer standing, 19 mounds face east. And the wind that comes down off the ridge carries something that cannot be easily explained in words. Some stories the mountains keep because the people who lived them could not afford to tell them. This one stayed buried for over a century, and when it surfaced, the only person who could have explained it was already in the ground. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, and share it with someone who needs to hear it.